What if we could step into a parallel past, one that history books left behind? Let's turn the pages and uncover the dark truths they never wanted us to see.
If I told you that tens of thousands of children had their records erased, their very existence denied by governments and institutions, would you believe me? If I told you that some of these children might still be alive, trapped in underground facilities, forced to participate in experiments that can never be exposed, would you be able to sleep at night? In the mid-20th century, multiple countries experienced waves of mass child disappearances, particularly among orphans, foster children, and those living in welfare institutions. They had no families, no one to search for them, no one to care where they had gone. That made them the perfect targets, victims of government projects, medical experiments, and illegal trafficking networks. Everything you're about to watch is based on true historical events. I will tell these stories through the eyes of those who lived them, but every word is grounded in real, documented history. I have never dared to go back to that place. The day before my 60th birthday, I received a package in the mail. Inside was an old black and white photograph, yellowed with age. It showed a group of children dressed in tattered clothes, standing outside a Quebec orphanage. Their faces were blank, their eyes hollow. On the back of the photograph, a single line was scrawled in messy handwriting. "Do you remember Thomas?" My fingers trembled as I held the picture. A flood of memories surged back, memories I had tried to bury for decades. Thomas? Of course I remembered him. I remembered how he would stand in the orphanage yard, staring up at the gray sky as if searching for a hidden secret. I remembered him whispering to me at night, warning me, "Don't drink the milk, don't trust the nuns when they smile, and whatever you do, don't open your eyes at night." But Thomas had disappeared long ago. They told me he had been adopted, but no one ever saw the family who took him. No one knew where he had gone. And now, someone was asking me if I still remembered him. I ran my fingers over the photograph, feeling its weight, as if the truth was imprinted deep within the paper. For years, I had forced myself to believe that Thomas had simply been lucky, that he had found a home, just like the other children who had mysteriously vanished from the orphanage. I told myself they must have gone on to live happy lives. But had they? I grew up in St. Matthew's Orphanage. It was a cold, lifeless place with walls covered in cracked white plaster and a constant stench of disinfectant and rotting wood. Every day we were taken to prayer, fed moldy bread and watery soup, and taught one thing: obedience was the key to survival. Thomas was 3 years older than me. He was tall and thin, with pale skin and an eerie way of watching the nuns. He rarely spoke, but he was sharper than any of us. He could sneak an apple from the kitchen without anyone noticing, hide it under his mattress, and listen in on the low whispers of the headmistress and doctors, even when they spoke in French. One night he whispered something to me that I never forgot. "We're not orphans, Daniel. We're experiments." I didn't understand what he meant, but the way his voice trembled made me afraid. Nights at the orphanage were always cold. We huddled under thin blankets on the wooden beds, listening to the wind howling through the cracks in the windows. Sometimes, if you listened carefully, you could hear the heavy iron door at the end of the hallway creaking open. And sometimes children were taken. They never came back. "Where do they go?" I once asked the nuns. They smiled, but their eyes remained empty. "They've been adopted, dear. They've gone to a better place." But one night, I heard footsteps outside our dormitory. A moment later, I heard Thomas's voice, low, urgent, trembling with a fear I had never heard before. "Daniel, don't make a sound." The door opened. A group of nuns in black robes stood around his bed. Thomas didn't fight. He simply stared at them, unblinking. Then a man in a white doctor's coat stepped forward, holding a glass of milk. I held my breath as Thomas took the milk. He stared down at the glass for a moment, then smiled faintly and handed it back. "I'm not thirsty." The air in the room grew thick, suffocating. The nun's smiles vanished. The doctor's expression hardened, then he nodded. Two large men stepped forward, grabbed Thomas by the arms, and clamped a hand over his mouth. He didn't struggle, he just let them take him. That was the last time I ever saw him. The next morning, Thomas's bed was stripped clean. His name had been crossed off the orphanage records. His photograph was gone. It was as if he had never existed. I asked the other children, but they wouldn't answer me. Their eyes were filled with fear. Only one younger girl dared to whisper to me at night, clutching my hand. "They took him to the mental hospital," she said. "The ones who go there never come back." In 1999, the Canadian government declassified some of its records. They revealed that thousands of children had been illegally committed to mental institutions where they were subjected to electroshock therapy, drug experiments, and even forced brain surgery. These were not mentally ill children. They were orphans, or children who had no one to fight for them. In 2004, investigative journalists uncovered a mass grave beneath an abandoned psychiatric hospital in Quebec. Inside were the remains of dozens of unnamed children, their ages ranging from infants to teenagers. No death records, no hospital records, no names. The government gave no clear explanation. Their official statements were vague. These were mistakes of the past. We deeply regret what happened. But I remember the footsteps in the night. I remember the children who were taken. I remember the cold, silent stares of the doctors. And I never found Thomas. His name had been erased from every document. His life had been wiped from history, but I knew. The glass of milk, the silence of that night, the iron door that never reopened. He had been here. This is not fiction. It really happened. The Duplessis Orphans scandal involved more than 5,000 children. The bones discovered in that unmarked grave may only be the tip of the iceberg. So how many children really disappeared? Where did they go? Are some of them still alive? Or were they erased as if they had never existed at all? Sometimes I dream about the ship. It drifts on an endless sea surrounded by darkness. I see myself standing on the deck, the wind tangling my hair, the salty air pressing against my skin. Around me, a group of children huddled together, dressed in ragged clothes, their faces frozen in fear and confusion. Then, the ship slowly pulls away from the shore, and with it, our past is erased. My mother died of tuberculosis, and my father vanished after the war. I was placed in the care of the government, labeled as unaccompanied, and sent to an orphanage. It wasn't the worst place to grow up. At least we had food, though never enough. The nuns were cold, but never cruel. Yet something always felt off. Every few months, children would disappear. They weren't adopted. They weren't claimed by lost relatives. They were simply sent somewhere better. At first, I thought this meant they had found new families, but no one ever heard from them again. No letters, no visits. Even the nuns stopped mentioning their names, as if they had never existed. "You're going to Australia," the nun told me one morning in 1952. "There will be new schools, a new family, warm sunshine, and beautiful farms. You're going to love it." We were taken to a ship, crammed together with hundreds of other children. Some were older than me, others barely 5 years old. None of us spoke much. There was no excitement, no joy, just silence and uneasy glances. The lower decks were damp and reeked of vomit and mold. I asked one of the older boys, "Do you know where we're going?" He looked at me with an odd sadness in his eyes. "They say we're going to new families," he whispered, "but I don't believe them." I pressed my face against the small window, staring at the ocean stretching out into the unknown, and that was the moment I realized we weren't being sent to a better life. We were being sent into the unknown. When we arrived in Australia, we weren't taken to families. We weren't given warm welcomes. We were sorted into groups and sent to institutions, work camps, and religious homes. I ended up in a place called Bindi Children's Home, but it was not a home. It was a labor camp. We scrubbed floors, tended crops, and carried heavy buckets of water under the scorching sun. If we worked too slowly, we were beaten. But the worst part was the nights. Some children were taken away, sometimes for hours, sometimes forever. I once asked an older girl what was happening. She whispered, "Some of them never come back. Some were sent to farms as unpaid laborers, their tiny hands raw from endless hours of work. But others, no one knows." In the 1960s, I overheard a local man mention that wealthy families could purchase these children to serve as house servants, or worse, as playthings. Rumors spread of children being sent to secret facilities for psychological experiments, drug trials, and mind control research. Then there was a place called Blackstone House, a secluded facility where children were taken but never returned. No one ever confirmed these stories. No one ever admitted the truth. In 1987, the Australian government declassified certain documents. They confirmed that over 10,000 British children had been secretly shipped to Australia, Canada, and other countries without their parents' consent. They were not sent to loving homes. They were placed in work camps, religious institutions, and forced labor farms. Many were beaten, starved, and abused. Some were erased, their files destroyed, their fates unknown. In 2009, British Prime Minister Gordon Brown issued a formal apology. "We are truly sorry for what happened." But does an apology change anything? Does it bring back the missing children? I am an old woman now. My hands are wrinkled, too weak to hold the ship ticket I once carried. But I still remember that night, the night I sailed toward the unknown. I am still searching for my friends, the children who boarded that ship with me. But they have been forgotten by the world. Where did they go? Are any of them still alive? Or were they erased as if they had never existed at all?